Let's talk about breaking path dependence, shall we? How many times have we heard phrases like, that's the way we've always done it, or we've never done it that way before? And sometimes it's even branded path dependence. Well, you just don't understand. That's the CBC way. Now, it's okay if we are talking about a core value, being something. It's not okay if it's a way of doing something. You see, we can get locked into doing things a certain way without even thinking about why. And this is why we tend to approach problems in the same way. We resort to asking the same questions, looking at the same data, making decisions based on the same old criteria, involving the same old people in decision-making processes, and we look past potential new solutions and end up making similar decisions to what we did last time. Now, this does make sense somewhat because these patterns are well worn for a reason. They've been useful in the past, but this blocks us from creativity. Now, crisis forces us to challenge our assumptions and hopefully path dependence, or at least it should. Even the language we use can lock us into structures and path dependence. I mean, are you watching the news right now? Do you see that the U.S. government still reports employment in terms of non-farm payroll? You'd think that would have been updated by now. Let's take a look, though, at path dependence. There are really three types of path dependence where we get locked in. The first is cognitive, and that is something that's more personal. It's our mindset and mind frame and how we look at things. The next would be cultural, and that is a collective way of looking at something, and that often limits our mindset and mind frame as well. And finally, procedural. That limits our system. It's process limiting in its scope. Breaking path dependence first requires us to find a deeper awareness of where we are personally or organizationally and how we are locked in. So the first step in identifying these well-worn paths is to walk through the following framework I have here. Then we'll take 3 to 5 minutes to audit and document these limiting factors at the conclusion of this session and take time to walk through each one then again as a group. Now, let's get started. So what happens in a church is somebody comes up with a reasonably good idea. They put it into practice and someone says, this is good. This is a good practice for this particular ministry area. Then somebody says, I wonder if this would be good in this other area of ministry as well. And it is. And so it becomes a proven practice. And sooner or later, we start to get locked into different policies and processes and systems, and it becomes part of those as well. And it becomes a church preferred practice. If you're going to do this, you need to use that or that approach, that practice. Then we get completely locked in. Now, if we want to examine ourselves well, I have 6 different ways that we can do that. First, we want to name our biases. We all are biased. We have a bias about our own ministry. We certainly have biases about other people's ministries, but we have to name what those biases are. Now, next we will list our assumptions. This is what we assume about this ministry practice or this ministry as a whole. And we need to understand that our assumptions are based on what we assume everyone else would think, but may not think that necessarily. Then we want to audit our policies and procedures. If you haven't noticed here, these are some of the foundational things that you would say make up culture. And so really what we're doing is this is really helping to audit our culture a little bit as well, because the policies and processes that you put in place create and embed culture and continue to lock into doing things in certain ways. It's a shared behavioral issue, a shared worn path that we might all have. Next, then we want to list our habitual solutions. Now, again, these aren't necessarily bad because these solutions have solved other problems for us in the past. So it makes sense that we would go to these, but we want to list what those things are so that we're at least aware. And they may work in this situation, they may not. Next, we want to name common advisors. So common advisors might be people in formal authority or informal authority, but these are the people that leaders in the organization will go to for advice. And again, these could be inside the organization or even perhaps outside the organization, but we want to figure out who those people are and who we all commonly go to, because we would like to include a couple more perspectives to that list. Not saying getting rid of all these people, saying adding maybe a couple of different perspectives to that. And then finally, we want to audit our KPIs and measures. Now, I get asked, what's a KPI? Usually in private, because everybody tosses that term around and they don't know what it means. It means key performance indicator, which is a big fancy way of saying measures. But what we measured before, we need to re-examine and say, okay, we say something is important when we measure it. What are we saying is important now? So there's a difference, by the way, between audience, attendance, and view count. It's really important to decide what is important to us at this time to measure, and are we measuring the right things? We do want to measure because we want to benchmark where we are to see if we're growing and moving forward. It's just, do take a step back and ask yourself, are you measuring the right things? Or you're just measuring things that you could maybe get excited about, like view count on your live stream. All right, now that you have done this as an individual, I want you to consider, what are the 3 biggest limitations you think your church has when it comes to being locked in? Is it biases, assumptions, policies, and processes? Like, which 2 or 3 are your biggest issues? Now, I want you then to get together collectively and walk through that and decide what are our 3 biggest issues, and perhaps how might we respond to those limitations. So again, you're going to do this individually. I'm looking at my limitations, what I think are the top limitations, and I'm going to say, hey, here's how I think I would respond to that. Then I'm going to take that to the group, and as a group, we're going to then decide that and wrestle through it as well. This is really going to help us move forward. This will prepare you for the next section, which is probably what you really came here for.